Hello guys, Charles here and welcome back to my channel. So today I just want to quickly share a couple of ideas with you. These are based on a lot of the time my experiences with students who are really particularly jazz focused. Now we all have different goals and objectives, but a very common one is to be able to apply stuff, whatever that stuff is, over standard chord progressions, because the idea is, of course, if we can play over all the standards, then really we're going to struggle to find scenarios that we can't play within, because the standards are so broad, they cover so much of the musical spectrum that any situation we find ourselves in, we're likely to be able to tackle it. And that's a very, very good objective. Now, the issue we have a lot of the time as players, this applies in particular to two types of player. One is the kind of student who can already play and is now interested in getting into jazz. So that was me once upon a time. I was a rock and blues player, and then I decided right now I want to do the jazz thing. And so we think, let's get straight into standards. The other person who this relates to a lot is people who've been playing a bit longer and are now interested in like outside language, and they want to now apply that outside language within standards. And so those two players, they often kind of have a very similar problem, which is they're trying to play over standards and it's not really working, it's not clicking. And I often have to remind these students, and I often have to remind myself as well, because I still find myself doing it even though I teach this way, that playing standards is our end result. That's the final goal. That's kind of our dream, is to be able to do that really effectively. And so just by starting to play standards, although that works for a lot of people and it's a great approach, there's other approaches as well. We don't need to dive straight in at the deep end of playing standards. And so here's a couple of ways that we can make that process a bit more progressive and feel that we're really making some progress, because the issue with just playing standards over and over again is we can't really tell if we're getting better from week to week. And one of the real important elements of improving at any skill is that you have some element of measurable progress. Not only does that keep us motivated, but it tells us that what we're doing is working. So here's a couple of ideas. And the first is so simple, and yet, again, I find myself doing this more and more nowadays, and that is simply playing over one chord vamps. Now, one chord vamps are great because there's no surprises, there's no shocks. You always know what's going to come on beat 1, 2, 3 and 4 of the bar. Of course, in a standard one, we've got sometimes upwards of 10, 20 different chords throughout the song. There's a lot of surprises, a lot of things which our ear can't really predict. When we're playing over a one chord vamp, we know exactly what to expect, which means when we're experimenting with really simple ideas, maybe just we're at the stage where we're trying to just learn chord tones and really nail those, we can sit for 5 or 10 minutes on a one chord vamp, just focusing on that one chord type and really focus on, well, can I do a minor 7? Can I really nail the chord tones of a minor 7 chord on every single beat of the bar? If you're playing outside ideas, can I really resolve these ideas effectively at certain points of the bar? So you might want to have a bar of tension, a bar of release, or you might want to have the forward motion approach, chord tones on beat 1 and 3 and whatever you like between. Doesn't really matter what it is, but knowing that you've got that foundational, reliable chord tone sitting there through your vamp is really, really helpful. And so it makes sense that if we can't even do it on one chord, we're going to really struggle to take it through changes, take it through movements. So really focus on the minor 7 chord, which is the same as the major 6 chord, major 7 chords, dominant 7 chords, diminished chords, maybe augmented chords, minor 6 or Dorian sounding chords as well, and any other chord type you like, but really focus on one chord vamps and think of it logically and think, well, if I can't even do the one chord vamp, then that's, we've got to get that down before we can move on. So the next thing, of course, would be just working on very short progressions. So maybe just 2 chords, 2 bars, 4 bars, very, very short phrases. Maybe the middle section of rhythm changes, that cycle of fifths, or maybe just 2-5-1s or 3-6-2-5-1s, but just taking out small progressions. Chad L.B. talks about this a lot. The idea here basically is that if you know all these smaller cells of chord progressions and you really know how to tackle them. Standards are basically a jigsaw that are built from these smaller jigsaw pieces. Once you've mastered these jigsaw pieces, you can put them together in lots of different combinations to create different songs. And as long as you're comfortable with each of those jigsaw pieces, then the song itself isn't too daunting. So work on smaller progressions as well. Again, whether you're just new to improvising, really make sure you can create some interesting and simple melodies throughout these, and make sure if you're a more advanced player and you're working on chromatic ideas, that you can really resolve your concepts effectively through the changes, and that we can hear the changes with or without the backing track. It's also worth saying at this point that both for the vamps and these smaller progressions, we're not just interested in soloing. We want to make sure that we can play interesting voicings through these as well, so that our entire skill set is improving. We're not just interested in being a solo guitarist playing single line stuff. I was having an interesting discussion in the comments this week with a chap whose name I've forgotten, sorry about that, but we were discussing the term lead in general. A proper, well-rounded jazz guitarist is expected to be able to play solo, accompany, comping, and comp themselves whilst soloing. So you want to make sure that you can do all three of those on a single chord and through smaller progressions as well. And then finally, when you do start to tackle standards, again, the end result is that we can play perfectly freely and do whatever we want over the standard. But that shouldn't be where we start, or at least it shouldn't be exclusively where we start. We need to give ourselves smaller improvisation challenges throughout those changes and throughout that set of progressions. So there's two ways you can do this. One way, which I don't really like but works for some people, is to just slow the tune miles down, like 60, 50 BPM, and work through everything at a slower speed. I prefer a different approach, which is similar to something Jerry Bergonzi recommends, which is full speed at all times, very similar to what I discussed with transcription. Full speed at all times, but make it simpler by giving yourself different challenges. So you might solo through the changes only one note per chord. Can you do that? Can you play where you only play one note per chord? Can you come up with something interesting? Or is that too hard for you? If it's too hard for you, maybe the song is too difficult and you want to choose an easier standard. Maybe if that is too difficult for you, can you play one note every 2 bars? And once you've got that down, one note every bar, can you do 2 notes every bar? Well, when you're doing 2 notes every bar, you don't have to do those as half notes. They could be all sorts of different rhythms. There's a lot of rhythmic variety if you were using 2 notes in a bar. So limit yourself to 2 notes in a bar, come up with the most interesting rhythms you can. 3 notes in a bar, 4 notes in a bar. Definitely working your way up to at least 8 notes in a bar, which is of course our 8th note bebop feel. And if you're wanting to be a modern player, you're gonna have to push it even further, 16th notes and probably quintuplets as well, which is 16th note quintuplets. So that's 20 notes per bar. And you can see a real progressive approach there. Now, a lot of the time when you're playing that much stuff, it's not gonna be incredibly deep or beautiful, but it's a real milestone, it's a real challenge. And, you know, to play 20 notes per bar over a standard is pretty much impossible. It's just so difficult to do. But you can see the progression there, I hope, and it gives us something to aim towards. And then the final thing I suggest a lot of the time is maybe you're not ready to improvise yet over that standard, but that doesn't mean you can't start transcribing other people's solos. If you really have a standard that you love, but it just feels beyond you currently, well, transcribe as many solos as you can by your favourite players. Really simple solos, develop your transcribing skills, develop your language, and in doing that, you're better improving your knowledge, your awareness of how that standard works, how phrases work within the context of that exact chord progression. And that's only going to help you in the long run. Although transcription feels like the least immediate results, it can feel very slow transcription. It's hugely important. And if you were to transcribe 2 or 3 solos for every standard you ever wanted to learn, maybe as you go on the transcriptions get progressively harder, but even just simple, you know, Louis Armstrong solos or guys like Lester Young, stuff where it's not completely crazy, that's going to really massively impact you. And if you get in the habit of doing that over the course of 2 or 3 years, your standard playing is going to absolutely go through the roof. So to wrap up, there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach for playing over standards, but what does fit everybody is taking a challenge and breaking it down into smaller chunks. Perhaps not the chunks I've suggested for you today. It varies massively depending on the student, of course, what they can currently do, what they want to do in the end, and their interest level, the amount of time they've got available to them. All this stuff, when you're dealing with a student one-on-one, you can take into consideration. But as a general rule of thumb, those are some ideas that I might take a student through. But the takeaway here is don't dive in at the deep end. Diving in at the deep end is basically a recipe for feeling overwhelmed and feeling like you're drowning, I suppose, to continue the analogy, in what doesn't have to be a hugely complicated subject. And it can also be really, really great once you kind of feel, I don't know, you can plateau, I suppose, as a player. Once you're at a plateau, it can be great to go back to basics and say, right, I'm just going to work on one chord vamps for a couple of months, and then work your way back up through the progressions and really see what you can achieve. And when you finally return to playing standards, you're going to find, hopefully, that you've broken through that plateau and you at least feel you've elevated your playing slightly. So see how you get on with all those ideas. Give some more suggestions down below in the comments, please, with ways that you can make standards easier, bearing in mind that those are our end result, not necessarily our starting place. And if you did find this one useful, please do give it a like, subscribe, ding that notification bell, and share with any of your friends who perhaps are struggling with their standards. And as always, I hope you're all doing very well, getting plenty of practice in, and I very much look forward to seeing you in the next one. Cheers.
Roll up, let me embed a story you'll never forget. A drip, drip, but drowning in debt now. You can't buy your way out. And